What's up, everyone? Connor O'Hanlon here for another episode of the Greater Society podcast. Tonight, I am joined by an award-winning author, which this is a first. I've never been able to say that before, but an award-winning author and a former Democratic candidate for Congress, Dr. Andrew Bard Schmookler, who we will be discussing a number of his articles, his potential to dive into his books. So, without further ado, Dr. Andrew Bard Schmookler, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm eager to have you throw the pitches and for me to see if I can.
You can handle them.
Do like I used to see as a kid when I went to Tiger Stadium, then called Briggs Stadium, and watching the batting practice pitcher try to make the hitter look good.
Yeah. Exactly. That's definitely sometimes a challenge, but sometimes it's not. So hopefully you can make me look
as the hitter and the pitcher. I guess.
Exactly. Exactly. So first of all, let my viewers know a little bit more about you. I mean, I already said that you're an award-winning author. You've run for Congress. What are some things that everyone should know about you and that makes you who you are?
Well, I mean, one thing I could say is that I got hit. I had a sort of visionary experience in 1970 about what the story of humankind was about, what the forces are that have governed how our civilization developed, that changed the course of my life. And now, more recently, pursuing those same kinds of ideas has gotten me involved in politics, because there are forces at work in American politics that I first started seeing in the 1990s with Rush Limbaugh. And then in 2004, I had another sort of profound experience that set me on a new direction when I saw what it was taking over the Republican Party. Let me just say that in case people think, oh, well, this guy sounds like a partisan, that is not where I'm coming from. Back in the 90s, I was doing talk radio here in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, where I live, where I am sitting right now. The biggest AM station in Harrisonburg, Virginia, not Harrisburg, that's Pennsylvania, but Harrisonburg, had me on with a fair number of hours, but not nearly as many as Rush Limbaugh. They heard him 3 hours a day, And I was concerned about what was happening to those 20 million ditto heads whose minds he was poisoning. So that's why I went into radio. And I really loved the people I was talking to, very conservative, often fundamentalist, pro-Confederate, all kinds of things that I am not. But it managed to make conversations that really I respected where they were coming from. And I've had a ringside seat to see how they've been transformed. And it's been very disturbing. But anyway, it's not as a partisan. It's because back then, what I understood going on, I was a bridge builder. But by 2004, I saw that what was running the right wasn't something to build bridges with because it wasn't acting or speaking in good faith. And so that launched me on a whole new leg of my mission in this life. I had my own blog, 2,000 or 3,000 readers a day, where I was talking about the danger to American democracy that was rising. And then when I figured out at the end of 2010, I figured out that Barack Obama and the Democrats were simply not going to talk the way they needed to talk about what was happening.
Oh, we'll dive into that too. I will. Yeah. I have a question about that.
I'm delighted. Am I going on it too?
No. You're good. Keep on.
I'm happy to do back and forth. If it's batting practice, you just swing once, and either the ball goes out over the left field wall, or you pop it up, or whatever you did.
Well, no. Let me ask you first before we dive into some of your work. Tell me a little bit about the connection to like these revelations throughout your life, and like why it brought you to politics, why it's brought you to, running for office, like the decision making you had to go
Yeah.
through there.
Decision making is really a trip because you really can take a lot of different paths at any given point. Um, but anyway, the connection is, if I understand the connection, I mean, I look over my history and I say, how did this exactly unfold? It's not like it always presents the whole thing all at once. But anyway, I was in the business from 1970 to say 2004 of trying to understand what forces are at work that make the human world as filled with destructiveness as it has been since civilization first arose. So the idea of looking for forces at work was well established in my mind. I'd written 3 different books, that each identifying a different dynamic at work in the world that has to be controlled if we're going to get a good human future. I could talk about which those forces are, but not now. And so when I saw what was happening with the set of things that Newt Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh were doing, I recognized, I'd studied the Nazi regime intensively for my book, Out of Weakness, Healing the Wounds That Drive Us to War. So I was used to thinking about that kind of thing, but I didn't recognize how big it was. This was the era when I was still thinking, well, the people around me were basically good conservative people. They were not what they are now, though they are still the same thing in everything but their politics.
Sure.
Or mostly the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't get poisoned without having organ damage. But anyway, so I was then it struck me when I saw, I gave in 2005, I went around the country giving a talk called The Concept of Evil and Why It Is Intellectually Valid and Politically and Spiritually Important. And what I saw was that there was an amazing consistency to what was coming out of the Republican Party when W and Karl Rove and Cheney and Fox News and the Koch brothers were all in this constituents, very powerful players of a single coherent force. So the consistency with which it was broken, that's the word I often use. Not everybody likes it, but it's not easy to talk about the issue of good and evil. And I've got a whole bunch of ways of doing it.
I have a question about that too.
Yeah.
But
Do you want me to stop?
No, you're good. You're good. Keep going.
So I saw what was happening, and I started talking around the country to show the pattern. And I came up with a definition of evil. Actually, I didn't articulate it for some years, but basically, evil defined as a coherent force that consistently works to make things worse, or the way in my own semi-jargon, consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness. And I saw that this had hijacked the Republican Party starting in 2004. I saw this is big. And I started already to grieve for the America that I grew up in. It was painful to see what I saw. And it was particularly painful because I was engaged in a project that was about the good, the true, and the beautiful. And here I was having to work on the problem of the lie, the ugly, and the evil. So that's how I got there. And then I write all these things. I try to recruit some people whose names you would instantly recognize, much better spokesmen for what I wanted to hear said than I would have been, because they already commanded a national, I could talk about who. There's no reason it has to be confidential, but I won't say at this point that it was Bill Moyers after I failed with the Democratic candidate of 2004, Kerry, John Kerry. They were in a position to do something. I worked for a half year to get either one of them to do it. And then I decided, okay, well, the only thing left is do it yourself, So that's what I did for 6 years, wrote several thousand essays. They're still available. You can get there from my website, which is abetterhumanstory.org. But
And that is linked in the description of this, by the way. So
right.
if you're enthralled by this conversation, check that out in the description box.
So you go down, if you're on there, you go down to None So Blind, and it's archived. I didn't keep paying the rent, but some kind souls out there took the whole thing and put it out there. And so you can still get to all the stuff I tried to put out there to liberal America to raise the alarm. This is not okay, what's going on. This has got to be recognized for what it is, and it has to be fought for what it is, which is a coherent force that consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness, which is my definition of evil. And you don't have to call it evil. You can call it a force of destruction or a force of brokenness, but it actually acts like evil has traditionally been understood to act. And that was sort of my third major insight in my life. Well, so when I saw that Obama wasn't going, I got a piece into the Baltimore Sun before his first year is over, calling on him to fight the battle he was elected to fight and not to forfeit it. I mean, I love Obama, but he blew it.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Let me ask you about that. You, in your first article, the first article that I read, at least, I did them in chronological order of when you wrote them, that I read them, and then I have questions about here. So let me just talk to you about the explanation that I'm looking for is, what do you mean by the moral and spiritual passion has been drained from liberal America? And I can quote it for you. You said that in your article from Cry the Benighted Country. So what did you mean by the moral and spiritual passion has been drained from liberal America?
You know, it's interesting you should raise that, because the last week and a half I've been writing this piece. It's about 2,000 words long, about the reality of value. You know, what I mean is, and the reality of the spiritual dimension. I can talk about, what from a completely secular point of view, just reasoning about the evidence. I feel like I can establish something which is not widely enough recognized in the secular worldview of our times, which I think is a powerful part of liberal America in particular. The religious believe, they were helped to understand certain things by what the religion presented to them. But then if you become secular, you cease to have things like, the devil, to represent something like a force of evil.
Yep.
You don't believe in the supernatural anymore. You believe in the truth that you can discover by looking at the evidence and applying reason and logic to it. So I think that too much of liberal America thinks that value is just a matter of opinion. It's not really real. It's not really real because you can't prove it objectively. It's merely subjective. Now, my argument is, and we don't have to go into it for this, at this point, but my argument is the only way value can exist is through experience. If there's nothing that experiences anything is better or anything is worse, it cannot mean anything to say that there is value. But evolution has produced creatures like us who are crafted to experience some things as better and some things as worse. And what we experience as better is to give us the motivation to do what our ancestors had to do in order to survive, to pass along their DNA to us. The process of natural selection creates creatures for whom there is value. Value in the only sense it could mean. And then I've got a similar argument about the spiritual dimension, which is to show that there's a special level of experience that a whole lot of human beings experience at some points in their life. Mm-hmm. And they're very impactful. I don't know where I got this number because it's back 25 years or something. But I think roughly a third of people will report having experiences of whatever the word is, spiritual nature, revelatory nature, something that, of a level in which the things are experienced as sacred. And those experiences are very impactful. You can infer from that, from the fact that it seems to be a capacity that we have, and I don't know if other species have it, but we've got it. You can infer from that it's been selected for. It didn't just plop down in there at random, Stephen Jay Gould, the famous evolutionary anthropologist, talked about spandrels, which were things that just happened to emerge in somebody's genome, but not for any particular reason of adaptation. Well, I don't think that these experiences that people have could possibly have just been a byproduct of something else. Things don't get selected at random, and this is a kind of profound thing. So we can infer that it was selected for, from which we can infer that its major impacts were life-serving. In other words, groups of people who had the capacity to experience this special realm of experience were more likely to get their DNA into the future than groups of people who didn't have that in their genetic heritage. So but if you don't believe that there's such a thing as a realm from which important messages are to be received, if you don't believe that there's some meaningful sense, even if it exists only through the realm of experience, which is the only realm that I say that the sacred could exist. If you don't believe there's anything that's all that sacred, you've got a lot of people who don't have a religion, who are walking around without thinking that value judgments, even though they make them all the time, are really to be taken all that seriously. And maybe don't believe that the spiritual dimension is to be given a special kind of attention. They are not going to be as powerful when their job is to combat the force of evil that's arisen around them.
I think
that's the connection with the politics.
I think that's a very fair analysis of it. And I think the Democratic Party especially, and we're going to get to the Republican Party here in a second, but speaking as, somebody that is engaged and involved with the Democratic Party, it's an interesting look because in your piece, you're talking about the comparison to the Democrats of old, like FDR, and that New Deal Democrat and like what they stood for and the passion and the liveliness for the politics at the time that they brought. And do you feel like, let me read it. You have you stated that in the period from 2001 to 2009 that was among the most politically dangerous time periods in American history due to, and you wrote out multiple paragraphs about these things, but I summed it to an assault on the rule of law, including torture, as we saw under the Bush administration, wealth inequality, which is also supported by the Supreme Court's decisions, namely Citizens United, sabotage of the government for political gain, and the crippling of the nation's ability to respond to the climate crisis. Do you feel like in the 12 years or so that you said 2009, but let's say 13 years since that period, that we've improved? You could take that as a society, as the Democratic Party, or have we gotten worse? Have we developed in some ways and gotten worse in other ways? You can kind of take that however you like, but how do you feel about that dynamic? Because you did say that it was 2001 to 2009 was the most politically dangerous.
Do you know the story of Cassandra?
I don't.
Well, she's a figure from Greek history or mythology. She was from Troy. And she had the gift of seeing the future and the curse of seeing the future, because she kept on warning Troy, there's a problem coming, But anyway, so she had the mixed blessing of being right and watching her city burn down. So a lot of people, when back in the aughts, like when W was president, also when Obama was president, and I saw him trying to be a transformative president for the good. I mean, if he'd had a normal opposition, I think he could have been another FDR. He was very smart. He was the most decent guy that's been in the White House that maybe Joe Biden is that too, but I don't know. But anyway, I think he would have done fine. But there was a raid against him, something that was not interested in achieving what was good for the country.
Mm-hmm.
And the average, I don't want to badmouth Obama. I mean, I know the Democrats love him. And I do too.
It's a fair criticism. It's okay to criticize, in my opinion, and I think we agree. I'm a progressive person, so to me, it's like if the Democrats fall short, it's worth criticizing. We know that the Republican Party is in quite opposition, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but the Republican Party is like the antithesis of basically everything that I stand for in many ways. So it's not, to me, it's like a fair ball game to sometimes throw critiques towards Obama, to Biden.
It's not because he wasn't progressive enough.
Sure.
It was because he didn't see that he didn't deal with people who were acting consistently like his enemies, as if he was dealing with enemies.
Yes, I think we can agree on that.
That's another part of liberal culture, which has gotten in the way. But anyway, back in 2010, I reached that conclusion. I got to do it myself again. So the way I could do it, I had noticed that my congressman, Bob Goodlatte, who became later, after he beat me by a 2-1 margin, he became chair of the Judiciary Committee for the Republicans. I saw that he ran unopposed in 2010. So what I decided was the seat is unwinnable. I mean, I had witnessed how the right wing had become a closed cult where no voice that is critical of the authorities that they have adopted can be ever listened to. You don't listen to Democrats, you don't listen to scientists, you don't listen to journalists, you don't listen to people from other countries. You don't even listen to good Republicans who are trying to raise the alarm about what their party is becoming as soon as somebody opens their mouth. So I knew that I couldn't win in this district because the doors had closed in people's minds. Mm-hmm. But not everybody's in that boat. So I saw there was a platform that is worth using. And it was a platform in which I could say all the things that I thought should be said, mm-hmm. in all the ways I thought it should be said. And that's what I did for 2 years.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's basically like a free platform, and you're utilizing a position of power or potential influence to fight against it. I do have someone in chat that is saying basically that what we were talking about with the Obama administration and like not kind of treating like the Republican Party not as their enemy. And again, maybe not the entire Republican Party at the time, but Tea Party Republicans at the time, which is now leading further and further into the radicalization. But that is still happening today, where and I think it's happening a little less, but Republicans kind of getting their hands in the Biden agenda and trying to muddy the waters, and Biden not necessarily treating them as what they are, which is the enemy of his agenda in many ways.
Well, he did give a speech. I mean, if I had been his advisor, he wouldn't have waited that long to do it. But
right.
But on the other hand, getting stuff accomplished is important too. And but the thing is that every American who believes in democracy at this point, and I don't know what those numbers are, but I'm guessing it's like 2/3. From what I've seen, I follow the polls and this and that. I think 2/3 of Americans have no interest in moving down the road toward fascism. Mm-hmm. But the number of Americans who recognize that that's what the Republican Party right now is doing, and it's really open now. And I was talking about Cassandra because ever since Trump got elected, people who used to say, "Oh, you're too alarmist, Andy," have been saying, Well, it looks like you saw what was coming. That's the
Hmm.
Cassandra aspect. So I get to be right. But you asked, are things better now? Yeah, they're better in that the Democrats are awake now. Everybody's talking about books like about civil war and the path to tyranny and fascism and how democracy is in retreat around the world and how the Swedes and the Italians have just elected semi-fascistic rooted political parties to power. So there's a recognition now, and that's an improvement. And I feel much better about it. But back when I started talking about this, I wouldn't have said that it's really up in the air whether 10 years from now, our 2030s might be more like Germany's 1930s than like American democracy as we've always known it. That's up in the air as far as I can tell.
Piggybacking off of that real quick, I'm just going to pivot to your other article, the battle, and the name of this, the title of this podcast for today basically is the battle between democracy and fascism. I think that's a very important conversation to have. But I did have a question on it in saying, how does the fascism in the 20th century, specifically in 20th century Europe, compare to fascism on the rise globally today? From your perspective, and in America and globally?
Well, to tell you the truth, I kind of, rather than narrow it into real speciation, like
Mm-hmm.
how is Mussolini like Hitler, or how is Hitler like Putin, or how is Orban like, rather than make that differentiation, I think it's more illuminating to look at that this is the modern version of a dynamic that's as old as human civilization. Well, as old, I mean, it depends on where you draw the line. As soon as you get big empires emerging, in the Nile or the Mesopotamian civilization, or the Indus River, or the Yangtze, or the two or I guess it was the Yellow River in China, or the two in the New World. In each case, there's a process of several thousands of years from hunting gathering societies, maybe 5,000, to get to the point where you've got empires and you've got tyrants and you've got cruel regimes that exploit the mass of people, who most of whom are living lives that you might call slavery.
Mm-hmm.
That division between power being used in unjust, cruel ways in which a few work their will at the expense of the many. That's how civilization inevitably would emerge. That's a whole nother story going back to 1970. But it was inevitable that by the time you get to empires, all those hunting gathering societies and horticultural societies that followed, and chiefdoms and kingdoms, the process, because of the anarchy that obtained among them, and that's a big hint about my main idea, it was going to be a process that would lead to the coming to power of what I call the spirit of the gangster or the warlord. That's the kind of thing that inevitably rises to the top. And that's been an inevitable problem with civilization from the beginning. That's what our Constitution and all the other democratic setups have been finally arrived at in an attempt to combat. Our democracy is a matter of some centuries to solve a problem that's been around for millennia. The Constitution is a way of trying to control how power is used, which is not true in Putin's Russia. It wasn't true in Hitler's Germany, and it's only barely true in Orban's, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Modi in India. They're all converging on a set of things that just make the human world ugly. I mean, it's really a democracy versus fascism, or tyranny versus the consent of the governed. It's just a way of characterizing part of the struggle that inevitably arises with civilization of good versus evil. You can see the evils that come out of the fascistic spirit. You could certainly, look at Germany and what it did to the world. Look at Putin and what he's doing to the world. Look at Trump and what he's done to this country. The ramifications are, the lie, the big lie, as the Nazis called it, the big lie as we call it here now, the fomenting of hatreds between groups of people, the final solution of the Jewish problem, and the anti-immigrant passions, the picking on vulnerable people, like the gassing of the mentally retarded or whatever they were called in Germany back then, versus here Virginia's governor is picking on the trans people, and this struggle is so old, and the pattern is so recognizable. So it's not like we're heading toward the Third Reich. I don't know where we're heading. I wouldn't have guessed, even back in 2004 when I saw the darkness rising, I wouldn't have guessed that America would ever elect somebody like Donald Trump president. Wow. I mean, he's the last person. I mean, you could go through sticking a dart in a Manhattan telephone book for a good while before you'd come up with somebody more dangerous to the general good of the society. I've never seen anything like it. And yet we got to the point where the good people I did radio with were fervent supporters of him. And that's another set of issues.
Well, I want to ask about that. I don't know how to ask about that because I don't know these folks. But how did that happen? How did these folks that you kind of shift towards this? Maybe if people don't want to call Trump an outright fascist, a pseudo-fascist, or on the road, like if we were going to go to any sort of fascist government,
well, he's certainly a sociopath.
That and a narcissist, but
a malignant narcissist.
Yes. So how did that happen? Where you just saw these people shifting in that way?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I've probably written 24 articles to answer that question. And I'm proud of the articles I've written. But on the other hand, I really don't know the answer. I'm still bewildered. I mean, I've expressed this in the op-eds I write every week here in the Red my former district. I publish a piece every week in the Northern Virginia Daily and the Lynchburg newspaper, and I'm mystified about how intelligent people, and I know that they're intelligent, I do business with them and stuff like that, can believe what is patently untrue. I mean, the stuff isn't hidden. I mean, did it stop the steal? I mean, it's completely obvious who was trying to steal an election.
Yes.
I mean, how many court cases does it take with even Trump judges saying this is BS? But unless they're lying, they're telling pollsters they believe it. And I know they're intelligent, so I don't know how. I mean, it's a special state of mind that I've been trying to understand. I've got 3 clinical psychologists in my family, and I've been asking them questions since Trump appeared on the stage in 2015 about how to understand the phenomenon in front of me. And like I said, I can talk about it. It's got a lot to do with propaganda, I do believe. I think, I mean, at one level, I can answer it. I can say that thing I was watching with Newt Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh and then Fox News, they were engaged in a process to move people from a place where they could be intelligent to where, I've been watching The Manchurian Candidate, the movie from the version from the 50s with Frank Sinatra and Lawrence Harvey.
Mm-hmm.
You can brainwash people, but I don't understand how that works. But you seem to be able to get people into a place where they sort of download what their power structure is feeding down, and it goes straight in, like how about passing the time playing a little solitaire? And he goes into a trance, you know. I don't understand it, but I have read I could find about trances, but that's part of it. And the other thing is what I admired about these people. I mean, they were beautiful people that I was talking with. I admired their Christian values that they tried to live by, that came out in our conversations on the radio. I admired their patriotism about the Constitution. You know, the kind of people who like to hear speeches on the town square on the 4th of July, you know. I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy. You know, they love the Constitution, just like those phony Republicans walking around with the Constitution in their pockets while they were assaulting the damn thing and prepared to steal a Supreme Court seat at the end of it.
Well, they did steal one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they got well, anyway. Yeah, they didn't care about the Constitution.
Exactly.
So I understand those Republicans because they're just outright hypocrites and opportunists. Mm-hmm. I know from all the stuff I read, they know full well who Trump is, and we saw McCarthy demonstrate the utter hypocrisy of their relationship with this fascist leader. He spoke the truth after January 6th, and then he went down to kiss the ring because the base still was with Trump. And unlike Liz Cheney, he had no integrity. But I don't understand the people around here that are good to do business with, who would not rip you off, who would never stiff their contractors, who spoke in the 90s about how important character was. Mm-hmm. Now they're supporting a guy who's got a more florid bouquet of character defects than I've ever seen anywhere. And I've studied some monsters in my time, but nobody is blatant in so many ways as the guy that they. So how do they do that? How do these good Christians support the guy who's actually articulated just the opposite of the teachings of Jesus? If somebody hits you, he doesn't say turn the other cheek. He says hit him back 10 times as hard. I mean, he's the opposite. And he's the opposite of somebody who reveres the Constitution, and he's the opposite of a patriot. He betrayed the country. He made Ukraine more vulnerable, contrary to American national interest. And he betrayed his oath of office by trying to overturn an election. And yet these patriots, and they haven't said, oh, I'm not a patriot anymore. Somehow, they still think they're patriots. They got the American flag flying in front of their place, maybe accompanied by the Confederate flag, but yeah. I bet the Union soldiers would have loved that. Anyway, they support this guy who's assaulted the Constitution in a whole slew of ways. So I am mystified. I see it. I watched the propagandists work on them, but I don't understand what the magic trick was.
Yeah, and I think speaking of that patriot label, and you can't see it here, but I have my grandfather's American flag from, he served in Korea, and put it over his casket and whatever, folded it up, put it in the case. A longer term project of mine, and I think should be a little bit of everybody, would be to repatriate being a patriot and kind of taking back that. And I know that might be an uphill battle with some of that because the framing and the phrasing. But like, to me, I look at like some of the old school New Deal, Great Society stuff of the past and say, like, this is what a patriot would fight for. Like, this is what like somebody that cares about their fellow countrymen would fight for. So that is like why it is unfortunate. And it's the same thing. I told my my grandma, I don't know if I've said it on the show before, so if anyone is listening, and I have said this before, I apologize, but I've said it about Jesus. Like, I'm agnostic, but me and Jesus would have been best buddies. Like, we would have probably been like political allies, because we believe in the similar concepts and caring for the poor, caring for the sick.
You might have been moral allies. I don't think you've been political allies, because he was making every effort to avoid getting involved in the politics.
Fair enough. You understand what I mean, though.
he knew where the politics was going to lead, and indeed, eventually the Romans burned the whole thing down and threw everybody out.
Fair enough. It's speaking of that, I guess. How do you feel? And this is kind of piggybacking off of this, and talking about this almost like gangsterism that you're saying kind of exists throughout human society and leads us to this fascism. How do you propose or think, or maybe you don't think that we could get here, but to further democracy, to further democratize our systems, to further democratize even our workplaces? What is the best path forward to counteract this force?
Well, it's a multi-pronged attack at this point. I just wrote a piece that was on Daily Kos about called "The Vital Importance of the Coming Showdown," parentheses, between Donald Trump and the rule of law. And what I argue there is that the principle that nobody is above the law is a part of a broader fabric of what defines American democracy. And so that question of whether to prosecute, and I get very tired of listening to people, and I make a whole case for why it's a winner. There may be trouble prosecuting Trump. I'm not saying there won't. It wouldn't be the first time there had been trouble that we had to deal with. World War II was trouble we had to deal with to protect the basic. If you look at what Churchill and Roosevelt would say in their joint communiques during World War II, they pitched that battle not just about national interest and power, not mostly about that, but about human decency and the rule of law and the rights of human beings and stuff like that. That's what we were in fact fighting for. Though of course everything is more complex than just the grade B movies I always love to watch about World War II. The longest, it's compared to World War I, it's a great movie. But anyway, where was I going with that?
Well, I was asking you about the democratization and counteracting the fascist force, or like that swing towards fascism.
Yeah, so we have to fight it at all the levels. One of the things about good versus evil is that it is permit the whole. I sometimes picture a good chuck roast with fat marbling the meat. On an ideal chuck roast. The issue of good versus evil is spread throughout the whole system. I mean, it's got to do with how kids are brought up. I do believe that part of what makes the good people of the Shenandoah Valley vulnerable to what the propagandists did to them can be found. Part of the root is in the family structure. I was brought up in a family in which I could always question things. I was conceived in New Hope, Pennsylvania,
which is in Bucks County for
I was
everybody.
Born in Long Branch, New Jersey, to parents who believed in the things that need to be protected now, and that included bringing up their kids so that we wouldn't be the hypocrites that people who had been stifled more can become because they're not permitted to integrate some of the things they've incorporated. The question of how to make the world more whole, one of the conservatives can be really great when they've aligned themselves with an authority that's really good, mm-hmm. and is fighting for the things that they explicitly believe in. But they're vulnerable to being seduced by a different kind of authority because of some of the ways the family authorities worked. That's my theory anyway. And I've studied some of these things. It doesn't come out of nowhere, but I don't know that much about how everybody around me got raised, but I did get exposed to, like I had a kid in the school here who was getting a drink of water from the drinking fountain in his 5th grade school. And he was told, okay, you've had your 5 seconds by a school authority. Some things don't have to be regulated quite so tightly, but,
Right.
So
if I'm hearing you correctly, the hierarchies of a family structure have an impact on how people react to leaders and structures of government and systems. If that's the case, and that's where you come from, how do you break that programming? How do you reset it? Because the way that the picture is being painted, and it's not just you painting it. It's I think a lot of people see the writing on the wall. We are shifting towards maybe not a complete fall of democracy, but our democracy is not on the same strong foundation as we all would have hoped.
And as it used to be.
Sure. Or at least it was perceived to have been on.
Well, I think it. No, I grew up in this country, and we had our problems.
Yeah.
The Jim Crow South was still going on when Eisenhower was president, but we were pushing that back. Eisenhower sent federal troops into Little Rock to enforce it. We did have a democracy that was not threatened like this. In fact, I maintain that if you showed Americans, even conservative Republicans back in the time of Reagan or the first Bush, some kind of movie version of what the Republican Party is now as the Trump Party and what the Republican base is supporting, they would have said, unthinkable. No way that could have happened. I would bet tons of money that nobody would have expected it could have become like this.
I am interested in that because, granted, I have to take your word. I was born in 1996, but to me, Nixon and Reagan were like the catapult to Trump. They were the beginning of this launch towards it. Now, maybe they would have been, turned off by some of the underminings of democracy itself, but the Southern strategy and the war on drugs alone throw some wrenches into that for me personally. That's the way I see that. But I hear you, and I think that I've seen anecdotally Reagan Republicans switch to the Democratic Party. I think that's where you get like the Lincoln Project folks, which again I blame for bringing us to this point in many ways. But I think we're kind of on the same wavelength there.
You're right that the roots of all this were there. The corporate greed.
Yep.
I think it's intensified over the last 2 generations.
Yeah.
That was there though. I have a friend who's one of the world's foremost experts on what the asbestos companies knew and when they knew it.
Yeah.
Back then and before then, and they were willing to kill people for money.
Right.
So I don't have that illusion, but when Eisenhower was president, let's just say that, and continuing up until very recently, anything as crazy as the John Birch Society or the Ku Klux Klan, or as racist as the Ku Klux Klan, was shunted off by the Republican Party. I mean, there was a bit of backsliding when Goldwater got the nomination in '64.
Sure.
He didn't repudiate some people that I think William F. Buckley would have had him repudiate, and that Eisenhower might have repudiated. And there was Joe McCarthy's ugliness back in the early years of the Eisenhower presidency, but by and large, I think David Duke, when the first Bush was president, David Duke got the nomination, or maybe he was in a competition for the nomination. I think he had the nomination of the Republican Party in maybe Louisiana for the Senate or something like that. Anyway, the first Bush came out and explicitly disavowed that candidacy. We don't have that Republican Party now.
Yeah, I could agree to that, and I think there's specific figures in the Republican Party from the last 50 or 60 years, especially, that would stand out. I would say like someone like Mitt Romney, while I vehemently disagree with everything that he stands for, would denounce somebody like that. Versus, you have senators today, who knows? I mean, you could go down a line that wouldn't denounce these things,
Well,
and Trump
they,
included, obviously.
yeah, I mean, we know that they publicly know that Trump is what he is,
Yep.
but the base loves him. He will turn the base against them. They aren't willing to sacrifice their seat like Liz Cheney did. But they didn't get that way overnight.
Yep.
They were a party of all about power, not about principle. By the time Trump, stepped onto that escalator, the Republican Party itself was morally bankrupt in a way that it hadn't been under Reagan. Reagan, I hated having Reagan president, but he was a decent man who was capable, unlike some of his advisors, of responding to Mikhail Gorbachev and going a very long distance to end the Cold War peacefully. That says a lot about the man that isn't true about the Republican Party now.
Sure. I have a lot of qualms with Ronald Reagan, so we won't go into that here. But I think it's fair to say that they're not the same. One is worse and one has pushed it into that direction. I have one final question before I let you plug everything that you want to plug. And it comes from your article, when evil rises among a people. And it's actually a quote from a friend of yours that you have in the article. So I'm just going to read the quote, and then I have a question after that. The quote is, and I should say, if I'm correct, the quote is from a Holocaust survivor, right?
Yeah, he was a boy in Poland, a boy of 10 or 11, who survived because a Catholic Polish woman hid him at risk to her own and her family's survival.
Okay, so to shade this quote even further in, but the quote is, there are three kinds of people. There are those who will do evil no matter what the state of the world around them, and there are those who will do good no matter what. But both of these groups are small. The great majority of people belong to a third group. They will do good when that's how the people around them are acting, and they will do evil when the winds of evil are blowing strongly around them. End quote. Can you expand on how this sentiment from your friend and the person that you wrote about here impacted you and your work that you call A Better Human Story?
Well, I believe that our basic nature is aligned pretty much with the good, because I define the good as that which is conducive to the survival and the thriving and the fulfillment of sentient beings like ourselves and others. That's how I get to value. That means that the human experience is better, whereas the force of brokenness consistently makes things worse, like a world with hatred, or instead of, we'd be better off with love and justice and peace. And I think we all would prefer it. Now, I believe that I've identified some forces. I think the overwhelming majority of people would prefer a world at peace than at war, filled with love than with hatred, ordered according to justice rather than distorted by injustice, et cetera, et cetera. I believe that's what we want. Yet, the world has a lot of the other stuff in it. That tells me that there are forces at work besides what human beings are trying to choose. And I've devoted my life to identifying what those forces are. And there are several different kinds, and I've published about them, and I've tried to develop them. And I think that because we are oriented to what has been life-serving, because that's what we are born to be oriented toward, survival we are motivated to do the things that have been ancestrally conducive to survival. We like to eat when we're hungry. We don't like dropping rocks on our feet, and we would like to, and it's been conducive to survival to have harmonious societies with goodwill, peace on earth, goodwill toward men. I've come to really, I'm not a Christian, but I really think that there's a vision there of what's a recipe for a good life, including love thy neighbor as thyself, if you can manage it, and peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That's what makes a good world. And we've got forces at work that give us a world different from what we would choose. So we got to understand those forces. And then we got to get to work on bringing those forces under control. Now, I mentioned the one thing about how kids are brought up, but that's just one. Like I said, it's marbled throughout the meat. You could also ask the question, well, how is it that how did things work to get the United States to fight a civil war over slavery, in which hundreds of thousands of men were killed, including a whole lot of them in defense of slavery, in spite of the fact that that system was really contrary to their interests? All the brokenness that goes into that, it's huge. It's many dimensional. There isn't any. So, I say, grab hold of the issue and work on it. There's no limit to the number of places you can join. You could be a clinical psychologist. You could be a state legislator. You could be a teacher of kids in school. And in my case, you could be somebody who lays out, this is what we got to overcome. Right now in America, we got to overcome a force of fascism, which involves a convergence of forces under one political party's tent that used to cancel each other out because they were divided between two parties. And I can say a little bit more about that if you don't mind, but
go for it.
Yeah. So if you ask the question, like in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, what are the forces at work in America right now that make the country that get most in the way of America living up to its ideal of what it wants to be? Mm-hmm. I still never name two. There's corporate greed, the whole thing which led up to Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives, and, Sherman antitrust. But anyway, all that stuff, as the big corporate power emerged after the Civil War, the Republican Party became the home of that and pretty well controlled the presidency for a long time, with the exception of a couple of presidencies of Grover Cleveland. It was Republicans all the way from Ulysses Grant through William Howard Taft. And then Woodrow Wilson happened to sneak in because Roosevelt and Taft divided the conservative vote. But anyway, meanwhile, the other major force that made America a lot uglier than one would want was white supremacy. The lynchings, that ugly, the Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, defining against all evidence that separate was equal, when it was a regime of racial terror. Well, their home was the Democratic Party. Even FDR had to appease them in some ways. He was afraid of going too far against them. But they were on different parties, so they kind of canceled each other out. Then in the 1965, LBJ, a Democrat, passes the civil rights legislation, a couple of major bills that says basically Jim Crow oppression is done legally, constitutionally. And he said, when he signed the bill, he says to somebody, we've lost the South for a generation. Well, here we are, 2 or 3 generations and counting. But the white supremacist force migrated over a period of some couple decades till it's completely housed in the Republican Party. So now we got one Republican tent with two major forces of brokenness. So you ask me, how did that happen? Well, what happened to the base was one question. But the nature of the darkness that took over the Republican Party, that was possible because of two things. One is the convergence of those two mighty powers of evil into one unified alliance. And then the inability of liberal America to recognize the force of darkness that was taking over that party and to fight it in the terms that needed to be fought, which is, this is a battle between good and evil, defined. You don't have to use those words, but that is basically what it boils down to. Mm-hmm. When you look at the consistency with which the Republican Party is operating to make things worse, almost like I can't think of an exception, actually. And I am not a partisan. And that compels the Democrats always to be the party that's fighting for the other side of the issue. They have to be the ones that are fighting for democracy. They have to be the ones that are fighting for the truth. They have to be the ones that are fighting for racial harmony, because there's nobody else. And they have to fight against what the Republicans are doing. So it is a battle between good and evil, and the Democrats haven't recognized it. And I think it's partly because they haven't understood the nature of the forces that operate in the human world, and were not equipped for a battle of this nature. They were equipped for the usual politics where we quarrel about issues, but we don't have issues these days, hardly. I mean, Roe versus Wade, okay, it's sort of an issue, but it's a battering ram. It's a weapon in the fascistization, the theocratization, the handmaidenization of America. It is not a real, I think it's more fundamentally an issue of good versus evil. The way they did it, I could imagine a conservative court voting to say, no, the court had it wrong with Roe v. Wade, but not Alito's decision. Mm-hmm. That's a declaration of war. It's an insult. It's a theocratic decision. It's everything America shouldn't be. So a liberal America is gradually getting the picture.
I hope.
But it took a long time. And acting as if we've got friends across the aisle and like this is politics as usual, when it is not politics as usual, was a recipe for this thing getting bigger and bigger and bigger until, well, it's a little bit like Churchill. He came to power. It was almost too late by then. He had been a voice in the wilderness from 33 on. By the time he came to power, he's talking about, well, we should be willing to die on the beaches and choke on our own blood, because that looked like what it might come down to. And we are almost at that point, and I hope it isn't too late. And I say nobody should despair. We should all be fighting, because this is the battle that history has dealt to us.
That is a great point to close on there, and I completely agree. This is the fight of our lifetimes, and this is the hand we're dealt, so we gotta push forward and keep fighting. Andrew, where can people find you? Social media, your website, books. Where do you want people to go to find you?
Well, would you tell them how to spell my last name?
Yes, it's on the screen.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. You don't have to know how to pronounce it, but I pronounce it Schmookler because that's how my parents pronounced it. So my website, which is also on the thing, I'm laying out my my integrative vision, I call it. Like the pieces that I've put together, not just the 1970 idea, but all the other ones that aren't out there so much. I got the piece, a portal on the top left of betterhumanstory.org is called My Three Quirks Daily Pieces or Essays or something like that. I was invited to be a regular contributor every 4 weeks to the prominent and somewhat highbrow website, Three Quirks Daily. And so I'm doing my best to present a series of articles that lay out that picture. And those people who are not interested in the big picture, but want to see more about how I'm understanding the nature of the political battle in America today can find that in a couple of portals, including my op-eds Messages to the Conservatives, which is a pretty substantial collection. Not all of the pieces that I've written, but I've been writing a piece a week for, I think it's about 9 years now. So you can multiply 9 times 52. What is it? 468. But anyway, I got a bunch of pieces there, and the titles usually tell you what's in the piece, and then there'll be things like this podcast, which are on there too, where I'm doing my best to get those ideas out, because what's driven me for more than half a century is my belief that these ideas might actually help us to survive as a human civilization. And whether you're talking about the big picture or you're talking about America's battle between democracy and fascism, it's all part of the same battle. If America becomes a fascist country a decade from now, the chances for human survival take a substantial hit, because we either got to get our act together or we're going to destroy ourselves. And the first piece on Three Quarks Daily shows why that's true. And fascist America isn't going to help us get our act together. I mean, we can't look at Trump or the Trump party and see any signs that this thing is going to lead the world into creating the kind of order we need to create so that things like Ukraine and like the climate crisis don't threaten our survival. So we got to win this battle for human civilization to have a reasonably good chance to survive. I'm not saying we should give up if we lose this, but I really don't like to contemplate it.
Fair enough. All right. With that being said, you can find the link to a Better Human Story in the description box below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening to the podcast, it will be in the description of that as well. You can find, and I briefly showed it on the screen, the website. You can see my Three Quarks Daily series, the op-eds, Message to Conservatives there. You can see a bunch of series on there as well. Links to different works by Dr. Andrew Bard Schmookler, if I hopefully said that the way that you and your parents said it. Close enough, maybe.
Yeah, well, don't say Schmuckler, though.
Schmookler.
There's a certain vulnerability that comes with
Fair enough. Yeah, I don't mean to say it like that, but thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a very fun conversation. With that being said, for everyone watching right now, if you guys enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button down below on YouTube. You can hit the bell button to get notifications for whenever we go live. The podcast, like I said, is available on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify, so you can listen to the audio versions as well. If you would like to, you can support the show for as little as $5 a month on patreon.com/Greater Society Media. The show is available on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and you can follow me at Con O'Hanlon on Twitter. I think with all of that being said, thank you so much for hanging out. Love the enthusiasm in chat. You can join the Discord as well. There's a link to that in the description box below. So until next week, everyone, stay safe. Peace.